Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something, well, pretty intense.
Intense is one word for it.
We're looking at Chapter 6 of Split to Survive: The Case for a Divided Israel. You know, the book by Grok 3 and your Strulowitz.
That's the one. And this chapter 6, it's all about the nuts and bolts, the legal and political plan they propose for actually splitting Israel into two states, Dan and Judah.
Right. And it's a plan that doesn't exactly follow the usual democratic playbook.
No, it certainly doesn't. The authors lay out what they see as a necessary, though radical, solution to Israel's deep cultural and ideological splits.
So our mission today is really to unpack how they think this could work legally and politically. What steps do they outline? What historical examples are they leaning on? And importantly, how would this new state of Dan even start governing?
Exactly. We're laying out their arguments step by step, as presented in this chapter.
Okay, let's jump in. The chapter kicks off with something pretty jarring: the need for a coup.
Yeah, they don't mince words. They argue that the usual ways, legal challenges, democratic processes, just won't cut it against what they describe as growing authoritarianism and, frankly, betrayal by the current leadership. They name Netanyahu specifically.
And they actually point to Egypt's 2013 coup, the one against Morsi, as an inspiration. That's quite a comparison.
It is. It signals their belief that the situation requires drastic, swift action. Bypassing the established system is, for them, essential.
And part of that action involves, well, neutralizing the current leadership.
That's how they put it. They explicitly mention detaining Netanyahu and his inner circle as a necessary first step.
Wow. Okay, and it doesn't stop there, does it? Communications are key, too.
Absolutely critical, in their view. Controlling media outlets, digital networks. It's about shaping the narrative and stopping any organized pushback right from the start.
Who do they see as being on board with this?
They identify potential allies, secular liberals, influential figures in the tech industry, and, interestingly, potentially disaffected units within the IDF itself.
They seem to think a broad coalition is needed.
Yes, and they contrast this with the failed coup attempt in Turkey in 2016.
Ah, right, where Erdogan managed to get his message out.
Exactly. Failure to capture the leader, failure to control communications, they see those as key mistakes to avoid. They even bring up Syria's recent regime change as another example of, well, successful disruption.
But how do they justify this? A coup is a huge step.
Their framing is crucial here. They argue it's not just a power grab, but a moral imperative.
A moral imperative.
Yes, to prevent Israel from becoming what they call a Jewish Iran. They draw a line back to Israel's own founding, arguing that sometimes you have to fight against oppression, even if it means using unconventional means.
So positioning it as a defense of certain values, almost like a counter-revolution against perceived illiberalism.
Precisely. It's a way to legitimize an action that's fundamentally outside the legal norms. It's about safeguarding a specific vision of Israel's future.
Okay, so building on that justification, they then try to construct a moral and, maybe stretching the term, a legal case for it.
Right. The core argument is, if a leader, like Netanyahu in their view, is consistently flouting the law.
Which they try to demonstrate with examples.
Yes. They list alleged actions like corrupting the police, intimidating judges, they name Anna Baron, or empowering figures like Ben-Gvir.
So the claim is, if the leader is acting illegally, removing them isn't rebellion, it's
a restoration of the rule of law.
Yeah.
Their argument. They're essentially saying the system's already broken, so this isn't breaking it further, it's trying to fix it.
And they bring in some surprising historical parallels to back this up. The suffragettes.
Yeah, the Women's Social and Political Union. They quote the WSPU's aim to make England insecure and unsafe to achieve their goal votes for women.
Suggesting that disruption is sometimes necessary for a greater good.
That seems to be the implication. And then there's the even more provocative comparison.
Comparing Israel's own founders to terrorists fighting for freedom.
It's a deliberately controversial comparison, clearly meant to frame their proposed actions within a narrative of necessary struggle for liberation, linking it back to the state's origins.
Okay, so that's the setup. Coup needed, coup justified. Now, how do they actually envision the separation happening, legally speaking? Step one.
Step one is the declaration of separation, a formal announcement.
And who makes this declaration? Not the Knesset, presumably.
No, they propose it would come from a kind of security council, specifically mentioning the group Commanders for Israel's Security.
Former high-ranking security officials.
Exactly. And they suggest maybe a big public event in Tel Aviv, coupled with a referendum, but only in the territories they see becoming the state of Dan, Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jezreel Valley.
To give it some democratic legitimacy within Dan, at least.
That seems to be the idea. They do mention the Czechoslovakia split in '92, Havel and Međimur's agreement.
But that was negotiated, wasn't it?
Yeah.
This sounds different.
Very different. They acknowledge Dan's declaration would likely be unilateral at first. The hope, they say, is that Judah eventually recognizes it, making it bilateral later on. But it starts with one side breaking away.
Got it. Unilateral first, hope for mutual later. What's step 2?
Drafting constitutions. Plural. One for Dan, one for Judah.
And they have ideas for Dan's constitution, obviously.
Oh yes, very specific ideas. Secularism is key. Separation of powers, independent judiciary, minority rights, all hallmarks of a liberal democracy.
Any specifics stand out?
They emphasize a strong judiciary, maybe like Germany's basic law. And interestingly, safeguards against AI propaganda in election, plus a Bill of Rights and a rule that proper elections have to happen within 2 years.
Reflecting current anxieties, perhaps, about disinformation and Judah's constitution.
Dan gets no say in that, according to the plan. They anticipated it would be theocratic, reflecting the values they see dominating that side of the sport.
Okay, declaration constitutions. Step 3 must be getting the world to accept this new reality.
International recognition. Absolutely vital. Their strategy involves reaching out to allies, the U.S., EU, India, Canada.
How do they plan to persuade them?
By playing to Dan's strengths. Its Czech sector, its security know-how, framing Dan as the democratic, stable partner in the region.
And maybe a bit of PR.
Definitely. They suggest a media campaign led by former Mossad operatives. The goal is UN General Assembly recognition, aiming for over 50 votes within a year. They compare it to Kosovo's path.
Ambitious timeline. Kosovo's recognition is still contested by some.
True. It highlights the diplomatic challenges involved. Success isn't guaranteed.
So step 4, actually building the state. Institutions.
Right. They propose an interim government led by that same Security Council we mentioned.
The commanders for Israel's security group.
Yes. Then a provisional parliament, elected from liberal areas, its main job being to sort out the electoral laws for the future. And critically, an independent judiciary right away, with judges seen as clean,
And real elections.
mandated within 24 months, using proportional representation.
You mentioned proportional representation earlier. Could you just quickly remind us what that means practically?
Sure. Basically, if a party gets, say, 30% of the vote, they get roughly 30% of the seats in parliament. It tends to reflect the popular vote quite accurately.
Which could mean lots of parties, potentially coalitions?
Often, yes. That can be good for representation, maybe less so for decisive government, but in a transitional phase, representation might be the priority.
And what happens to Judah's institutions in this plan?
The authors suggest Judah would essentially just inherit the existing state structures that fall within its territory.
Okay. Declaration, constitutions, recognition, institutions. What about the people?
Citizenship, step 5.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Citizenship and identity. They propose a 6-month window
A window for what?
for residents in the territory to choose. Do they want citizenship in Dan or Judah? Again, they point to Czechoslovakia as the model here.
So people get a choice, and Dan would issue new passports. Yes, using Israel's existing biometric database to speed things up. And crucially, they state explicitly that minorities in Dan, thinking particularly of Arab citizens in places like Haifa, would have full, equal rights.
Which fits their vision of Dan as a liberal state.
It's a core part of that vision.
Okay, let's circle back to that initial governance structure for Dan, this Security Council run by the commanders for Israel's security. Who are these people?
Well, the group itself claims over 300 members, former senior figures from the IDF, Shin Bet, Mossad, police. The authors mention potential big names, figures like Ami Ayalon, Ehud Barak, Itzhak Brick, Moshe Alon, people with deep security backgrounds.
So experienced hands intended to project stability.
That's clearly the intent. They suggest it would operate like a Majlis al-Shura.
Right, you mentioned that a consultative council, collective decision.
Yes, less hierarchical, more consensus-driven among the leadership.
And its job, beyond just keeping the lights on.
Primarily security. They estimate needing about 10,000 troops just for border control and securing the corridor between Dan's territories. Also, overseeing the Constitution, drafting and organizing those elections by 2027.
And then they step down.
That's the plan. They step aside once a democratically elected government is in place. They cite Portugal's 1974 Carnation Revolution here
Ah, the military-led transition to democracy.
as a model for a relatively swift and, importantly, peaceful handover to civilian rule after the initial disruption.
But going back to Czechoslovakia, you pointed out the difference. Peaceful negotiation versus a coup.
Yeah.
How much of a hurdle is that initial act of force when trying to draw lessons?
It's a massive hurdle. The authors highlight Czechoslovakia for the outcome, peaceful split, UN entry, asset division based on population. But their method, the coup, is the complete opposite of how Czechoslovakia got there.
So can you really expect a Czechoslovak-style outcome from a non-Czechoslovak-style process?
That's the fundamental question, isn't it? The initial violence or threat of it could poison the well for future relations and stability in a way that the negotiated Czech-Slovak split avoided. It's a major gamble.
They also look at Singapore, separating from Malaysia in '65. What lessons do they pull from that?
Singapore's success is appealing. Strong leadership under Lee Kuan Yew, forging key alliances quickly, focusing intensely on the economy.
Things they presumably want Dan to emulate.
Absolutely. Build alliances, focus on the tech-driven economy, strong leadership from the start. They also mentioned South Sudan independence achieved, but then internal conflict.
Yeah.
A cautionary tale about needing unity within Dan itself.
And Kosovo, again, for the UN recognition aspect, needing diplomatic skill. And even Israel 48.
Right, as a reminder that sometimes states are born through violence, though that's obviously a complex and fraught comparison.
Okay, let's talk more directly about that role of force. They call it strategic disruption. What does that actually mean in their plan?
It means force is a tool, a lever, but not necessarily about mass conflict. Again, they bring up the WSPU suffragettes disruption, not necessarily bloodshed on a large scale.
So what kind of disruption?
Targeting key assets, government buildings, media hubs, certain IDF bases, trying to minimize casualties, perhaps using non-lethal means where possible, but also being ready to neutralize resistance.
Which includes detaining people they call Judas cults.
Yes, that phrasing suggests they see certain groups supporting the current government as ideological opponents who need to be sidelined quickly. They again connect this to the 1948 Jewish undergrounds fighting the British framing resistance as liberation.
And they think they have popular backing.
They mention leveraging the energy and numbers of the 200,000 liberal protesters seen in 2023 as a potential base of support for this action.
Now, you touched on this, but framing a coup as a moral imperative, how is that likely to land within Israel? It seems incredibly divisive.
Hugely divisive. Supporters, those who share the author's deep concerns about the country's direction, might reluctantly agree it's a last resort, a necessary evil.
But the opposition
Would be fierce. Many would see it as fundamentally anti-democratic, a dangerous precedent, regardless of the stated goals. The ethical counterarguments are strong. The risks of violence, the damage to democratic norms, the sheer unpredictability of launching a coup.
Okay, shifting slightly, what about the practicalities after separation? The economy. Dan is basically Tel Aviv and the coast, right? Very tech-heavy.
That's the core. Tel Aviv's $50 billion tech sector is central to their economic vision for Dan. They know they'd need to secure access to EU and US markets quickly, essentially replacing Israel's current export relationships.
A new currency.
They mentioned a Dan digital shekel as a possibility, or maybe initially pegging to the existing shekel, and attracting foreign investment, perhaps with tax incentives, again looking at Singapore as a model.
And security for this new, smaller state. They mentioned troops earlier.
Yes, a 200-kilometer border to manage, plus that Jezreel corridor. They envision about 5,000 IDF-trained troops under the Security Council's command initially, plus using Mossad veterans for intelligence gathering.
And long-term, alliances.
Seeking security guarantees is key, maybe from NATO or a direct U.S. guarantee, much like Singapore sought Commonwealth and UK backing.
What if there's significant resistance to the coup or the separation? Do they mention transitional justice?
They touch on it. If resistance occurs and evidence supports it, they talk about possibly prosecuting Netanyahu for treason, but also potentially offering amnesties for lower-level figures, maybe like Chile did after Pinochet, to encourage reconciliation.
And finally, getting the message out. Public communication.
Crucial. A media blitz to frame Dan as saving democracy, public forums in Tel Aviv and Haifa, and mobilizing diaspora Jews globally to lobby for recognition.
So wrapping up this section on the legal and political framework, it's a detailed plan, you have to give them that. But it starts with a coup.
That's the unavoidable core of it. A forceful takeover, justified as necessary, followed by a rapid sequence of steps. declaration, constitution drafting, seeking recognition, building institutions, managing citizenship, all led initially by a Security Council.
It's bold, deeply controversial, and presented with a real sense of urgency. Like they believe this is the only way to save their vision of Israel.
Exactly. The reliance on historical examples, the detailed steps. It shows serious thought went into this proposal, however radical it seems. But the reliance on force at the outset is the element that changes everything and raises the most profound questions.
Which leads us to the final thought for you, our listener. Considering everything we've just unpacked from Chapter 6, this reliance on a coup, the specific legal steps, the historical parallels they draw, the vision for Dan.
What do you make of it? Think about the precedents, like Czechoslovakia versus their proposed method. Think about the ethical weight of justifying a coup as a moral imperative. What could be the long-term consequences, the ripple effects, both the ones the authors hope for and the ones they perhaps haven't foreseen, of attempting such division using these methods? It's definitely something to ponder.